province. All were members of a nascent Bible study group which had been formed in order to better understand the ways of the neo-colonial British influence. Upon reading the Hebrew Scriptures, the founders immediately noticed some curious parallels between pre-colonial Sepoy practices and those of the ancient Hebrews. Both groups had in common rites that I've mentioned earlier, like circumcision, menstrual seclusion, a spring yam festival reminiscent of biblical Passover, and a kind of monotheism. Members of the study group, galvanized by the connections, insisted that the Sepoy must be descended from one of the 10 lost tribes. Since they were of Hebrew stock, they decided to call their movement the House of Israel. Curious to see if there were any lost Hebrews in the world, they sent a delegation to make an official inquiry at the Ministry of the Interior in Accra, the capital city. Unsure of what to do, and in the absence of official state ties with Israel at the time, officials from the ministry sent them to the Israeli embassy in Abidjan, the commercial capital of the Ivory Coast, which borders Ghana to the west. The group wrote a letter there to their long-lost brethren, which detailed the location and the desire to make contact. The baffled Israeli staff took the letter, and somehow this letter made it to a synagogue in Des Moines, Iowa. Nobody knows how. Thus began the extraordinary journey of a community of pastoralists toward modern-day Jewish observance. According to the Sepoy Jews, all ethnic Sepoy are Hebrew by origin. Some of them just don't know it yet. While hardline Anglican, Catholics, or others from colonial mission-based churches prove resistant to the recognition of these parallels and thus refrain from joining the community, those from certain independent African churches, and significantly Adventists, became attracted early on. Part of this attraction may have to do with Jewish Sabbatarianism being equated with the traditional mandated Akan Saturday Sabbath, which the British outlawed as a day of rest in favor of Sunday. Even among those Adventists in the Sepoy areas who have not defected, many have taken their cue from the Judaizers and now observe a significant number of Levitical practices. Another significant factor in their intertwined histories is that Sepoy Adventists represent the only non-Jewish group with whom the Judaizers find it possible to marry. As one older man put it to me, Seventh-day Adventists are a good catch because they do everything like Jews. The only slight drawback is this pesky belief in Jesus. Even when the initial group declared that Jesus was not the Savior, this same man told me, Adventists were the only Christian group that did not denounce the Jewish neophytes. When I asked whether or not they could marry only Sepoy Adventists, as opposed to those other tribal affiliations, the same man told me with no slight amount of contempt that all Akan people, of which the Sepoy are a subgroup, are Jews. This is Alex Arma, the leader of the community today, who was married to an Adventist. When I asked the local Adventist minister what he thought about his neo-Jewish movement, to which several of his flock had defected, to my great surprise, he had almost nothing but good things to say. He wished them well and understood their attraction to the new movement. Like the community member mentioned earlier, he maintained that all Sepoy are indeed Hebraic in origin, and that Jews could show the Sepoy the way back to their roots. However, he did express concern for the eventual personal salvation of those who had left. He hoped, he said, that his members would one day return, having become better Adventists through their experiences in the Jewish community. It should be noted that Seventh-day Adventists in Ghana have been present since 1894, and in the Sepoy region since 1957. Their presence thus predates the appearance of African independent churches by around half a century in the country, and in this particular region by several decades. While it's possible that an Adventist presence influenced the development of the neo-Jewish community in Sepoy land, we have no records to corroborate such a connection. All we can say is that Adventism is not seen as a neo-colonial religion, and that factors such as intermarriage, the valorizing of certain pre-colonial customs and lifestyle choices, the recognition of being a minority religious community, Sabbatarianism, and the absence of crystal-clear notions among many people about Judeo-Christian denominational specificities all create the impression that Adventism and Judaism are not really mutually exclusive. Now, the second case study deals with the so-called Internet Jews of Cameroon, which is a former German colony divided up later after World War I between the French and the British in West Central Africa. Unlike the Ghanaian example, in this group, at least initially, there was no perceived notion of any kind of Israelite or Hebraic descent. That wasn't a motivation. Instead, they were inspired purely by spiritual volition. What became known as Beit Yeshurun in Hebrew, House of the Righteous, was formally founded in 1998 after a group of about 100 evangelical Baptists who've been meeting regularly for Bible study became concerned with what they saw as apparent disparities between the Old and New Testament worldviews. Since formal study of the Hebrew Scriptures had been discouraged by the church hierarchy, this group took it upon itself to figure out why. What, they wondered, was this Jewish faith that Jesus had lived by? Why did the church encourage its congregants to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, but not in those of characters revered in the Old Testament, with whom many of the Cameroonian Christians felt, as one person put it, certain psychological affinities? The group eventually decided to try their best to live by the laws of the Old Testament. The details of that option were not yet fully understood, since it was unclear precisely what kind of model the approximately 100 people were searching for. Then came the internet. So you've got a picture here of some members surfing the internet in the community garden. This is a really interesting case study, I think, of globalization in general. You think about this village in Cameroon that never had state-supplied electricity, never had phone lines, being able to leapfrog this technological deficiency, basically with international migration to thank. You have Chinese migrant workers selling things like cellular phones and laptops and cellular modems coming into these villages. And this is the way that the Cameroonians finally made contact with Jews in the outside world and finally were able to go online and search for information they couldn't possibly get in their own country or with existing resources. So they literally did actually keyword search something like, what happened to those who decided not to follow Christianity and happened upon this term Jews, right? And it wasn't even Google, it was Alta Vista or something that came way back. So this is between 1998 and 2010. They're searching for this kind of information on the internet, solely online, through cellular modems and internet cafes that these Chinese migrant workers had put up. They succeeded in procuring an impressive amount of materials about those who, in their terms, still followed God's law to the letter, the Jews. In particular, they accessed a wealth of useful information from instructional sites run by Jewish groups. So one of those major sites is run by Chabad, which you might know is a Jewish charismatic renewal movement. This is the French version of the Chabad site. Chabad exists to bring backsliding Jews, secular Jews, back into the fold. Because Jews don't proselytize, the last thing people that maintain the Chabad site want to do is encourage conversion to Judaism. But as we know, the internet has a very addictive kind of democracy, right? These people in Cameroon, would access the Chabad site and download and print off materials to make themselves these kind of, handmade study guides about how to live proper Jewish life, thanks to this organization, which solely exists to bring back into the fold backsliding Jews. So sites like this Chabad site are among the first to appear in a Google search on Jewish topics, if you're doing this from a Francophone search engine. They all have French versions. They're easily intelligible since they presuppose no specialized knowledge of traditional practice. In the context of these searches, the group finally discovered the site of Kulanu, which means in Hebrew all of us, which is a New York City-based Jewish outreach group whose rabbis visited in 2010 and eventually agreed to mentor the community. So this is a picture I took when I was there in 2014, doing field work. Kulanu, among other things, gave the community a Torah scroll and instructed them in some of the rabbinic practices they have not yet been familiar with. In a way, this split the community because a lot of this intervention from outside groups was perceived as neo-colonial and unwanted. What they were trying to do, at least initially, was to follow some kind of Second Temple type Judaism, not post-exilic rabbinic Judaism. So about half of the community left. And so the community that we have today is made up of the initial Baptists and then significantly Adventists. So what are these connections? Mutual esteem and intermarriage are present, as in the Ghanaian example, but the most obvious links seem to be in the realm of envy. So infrastructural envy on the part of the Judaizers, and let's call it holy envy on the part of the Adventists. Adventists in Cameroon have been there since approximately 1930. Nobody who had been in the Baptist movement, at least as far as I could ascertain, ever had been involved with Adventism. So these connections can be fairly recent, post-2010. But during my time there, the Judaizers' envy was often expressed with regard to Adventist educational infrastructure, namely the prestige of Adventist universities in West Central Africa, and the growing number of parochial Adventist schools at which the Judaizers enrolled their children in the absence of particularly Jewish schools, because according to them, that would be the best place for the children to gain a proper understanding of the Old Testament. Adventists in Cameroon are also among the most vocal in their support of the State of Israel, and this put the Judaizers' fears at ease, especially with regard to the recent threat of the Islamic terror group Boko Haram being active in the country. I learned later from Chuck that pro-Israel stance is not necessarily something that goes along with Adventism in the global north, which was new to me. For their part, Adventists seem to be envious that the reigning regime under President Paul Biya, who's been in power since 1983, is paying much more positive attention to the Judaizers than to them, especially since Biya has been a long-professed Judeophile and Sabbatarian, whose personal security detail is composed of Israeli crack units on rather permanent loan. So the Judaizers maintain a site of their own now, which they use for outreach to other people who want to abandon colonial-based churches. And this has been one way in which Adventists come into contact with the community is by looking for Jewish-related topics online and finding this local website that they can access, and then they can call people or come visit. So with regard to the holy envy on the part of the Adventists, many in churches that I visited would like to go further, incorporating elements of African traditional, which they equate with Jewish religion, with their own Adventist concerns, such as forbidding of certain impure foods, maintaining of menstrual taboos, celebration of the annual harvest festival, separation of men and women during worship, and the careful consideration of dreams as potentially prophetic visions. So I can't really say to what extent these things are completely heretical in Western Adventist eyes, but people that I talk to in Cameroon at least seem to think these would be a good addition to their current practices. Several Adventists are also among many who have joined local Noahide study groups. The Noahides are non-Jews, righteous Gentiles who embrace the 7 laws according to the Talmud that God gave to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and later to Noah after the flood. And we have here some Adventist members with members of the Celestial Church of Christ, which is a prophetic church based in Benin. So, to recap and conclude, let us reiterate some important points common to both case studies here. Part of the reason for which Judaism appears to be, as Timothy Tennant puts it, theologically translatable to African Christians, Adventists included, lies in the anger that many feel at the institutionalized church, oftentimes equated with the colonial regime, over its exclusion of traditional native practices. Contrary to the perspectives espoused by Pauline theology, the legalism required in Judaism, Saturday Sabbath observance in particular, is not seen by such persons as burdensome. Rather, it is viewed as a doctrine that complements pre-colonial mores, and not, as one person described it to me, quote, post facto Hellenized mumbo-jumbo. Such sentiments should not lead us to believe that all Jewish-oriented movements and post-colonial paradigms are nothing more than reactionary. Nonetheless, by choosing to revere Jewish-like concerns, new adherents, but also sympathetic onlookers, such as Adventists, are in fact playing a role in movements that, while different by the law of doctrine, might be more mutually translatable in regard to the biblical convention that they appear to be at first sight. And of course, we also take into account the fact that millions of people sub-Saharan Africa do believe in Israelite or Hebraic genealogy, and so therefore one can be Jewish by descent, not necessarily Jewish by religious practice. Right? So what these groups end up doing with these intersections will be a fascinating thread to follow, and you've helped me as I pursue that thread, so thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. While we have transition, actually you won't need this one, you will need this one, or H and the whatever way it happens to be. We'll keep the questions at the end, or question period time, and while they're setting up the Mac, I will do the introduction. So Michael Sokupa, who is presenting next, is an associate director of the LNG White estate. He is doubly a doctor twice, holding PhD from the Adventist International Institute for Advanced Studies, and also Doctor of Theology, DTH, from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. I'm jealous because I love that campus over there. An ordained minister, he has worked for the SDA Church in a number of capacities: teacher, pastor, departmental director, and university professor. And before taking up his current position in 2016, he was director of the LNG White Research Center and Archives at Heidelberg College in Somerset West, South Africa. I'm sure that those of you who are from that part of the world or have studied there would say better, but I maintain Heidelberg. Oh, Heidelberg College in Somerset West, South Africa. His scholarly publications have mostly been in New Testament, but he recently published an article in Studia Historiae Ecclesiasticae on memory and Adventist history, the subject of his very paper today. Welcome, Michael Sokupa.
Thank you very much. My voice is giving up on me, and I'll resort to sign language at the end.
So we'll go from oral history to sign language history.
We'll learn together about that one. I'm looking at Adventist historiography in Africa, legitimizing oral history. This is a very fascinating area for me. I'm learning a lot as I'm developing this, and I'm hoping for good feedback as we look at this very vast field. There is a growing need to include perspectives that have been excluded in Adventist historical accounts of African origin. Most of these perspectives are available only in the form of oral history. This paper discusses the dynamics involved in authenticating oral history to provide complementary historical data that situates Adventist history from as many perspectives as possible. Most local Adventist history in Africa is based on oral history. And one understands that because most communities in Africa are oral communities. And I'm going to show some slides sometime later where I have visited some of these oral communities. And it was very interesting to see how the turn of events happened when we arrived at these sites. We had at one site the author of the history of the country, Adventist history of the country, with us. And I expected that everybody was just going to shrink and say, this is the man that knows it all. Let him, present the history. But he was in the background, and the elders were giving the story. And it was so interesting to see how a lot that is not appearing and surfacing in the textbooks and books written on Adventist history in Africa comes out of this oral history, as people are sharing stories, sharing a context that is missing from most of these historical accounts, which are basically focusing on the matter of chronology, how things started, and they focus on historical facts. But compared to the oral history that focuses on the real stories of what was happening and the interaction between the people in the community and so on. So this paper examines African Adventist historiography and the use of oral history. Another question to be considered in this paper is, what value does oral history have in African Adventism? Finally, this paper makes suggestions on how to validate oral history where there is evident lack of authenticity. The state of African Adventist historiography. There are very few sources of Adventist history that do not use oral history to back up their content. Adventist local history in Africa therefore depends heavily on oral history. I started collecting local Adventist histories from about 2011. When I left South Africa, I decided to donate some of the small collection to the LNG White Research Center for SID located at Helderberg College in Cape Town. When I was preparing for this presentation, I wanted to have access to Adventist history documents with the history of Madagascar, Malawi, Zambia, South Africa. Most of these sources are not listed in any academic database. They're not available in any local ABC or online. Some of them are written in local dialects. I could not even read them. But there is one thing that these sources have in common. They rely heavily on oral history. I met a student of history at IS in the Philippines recently, and he's working on a vital topic of Adventist historiography, and he is from Africa. But these local histories have no place in his work, and hopefully in the future he may continue to develop this topic further and include these histories. Conflict in African Adventist historiography. One of the reasons why we have a polarization of histories, it is because of this conflict. When one thinks of South African Adventist history, for example, you have a black history, you have a white history, you have a colored history, and you have anything else in between. Now, putting all these together is a huge challenge, and nobody has done it yet. The last work that I thought came closer to addressing the context of Adventism in South Africa was the doctoral work of Gerald Dupree's. He was focusing on colored work, but his work, unfortunately, was focusing on one perspective and never brought things together. One of the fascinating times I've had as a research center director in South Africa at Helderberg College was to actually arrange a heritage tour in 2013 around Cape Town. And I invited somebody who is knowledgeable from the white perspective, from the black perspective, from the colored perspective. And we were all in one team, and we were moving around these sites. And it was so interesting when we got to one site. This colored lady, Mrs. Peterson, stood there in front of the Salt River Church, which was the first colored church, and she was about to present her story, and she apologized for what she was about to say. And people said, no, feel free, talk. And they were willing to listen to what she had to say. And she was telling a very sad story of her pitching up at a church in Roland Street and being told that this church is not for you. You go over to Salt River. So these are stories that never surface in the historical accounts that we have, and this is a lot, an indication of the conflict that is there in the historical, especially oral history. All right, let me track myself now to find out where I am. Okay, conflict in African Adventist historiography. There is a historical work on Adventism in Ghana. Kofi Mensah categorizes his sources as archival materials, diaries, memos. At the end of the section in his bibliography, he has a category with no listed names or sources under the title Oral Traditions and Interviews. But when you look in text, Mensah has endnotes with numerous well-documented references to interviews. He obviously did not have enough room in his bibliography to list all the names of the interviewees he had cited. The author does not make any distinction between oral history and oral tradition. To illustrate the potential conflict between oral history and written history, I draw from the historical work of Mensah from Ghana. He cites oral tradition and references an interview with Pastor S.K. Asau. The oral tradition view, however, conflicts with the written history regarding the date when Dolphin, an Adventist pioneer from Ghana, came into contact with Seventh-day Adventism. The oral sources point to a time before 1888, and the written records have 1888 as the year when he accepted Seventh-day Adventist message. And so I kind of expected him to come up with a solution to this conflict, but he just leaves it as it is for the author, for the readers to decide which one is more acceptable. Is local Adventist history in Africa dying out? With the state of local Adventist history in Africa as described above, if the trends continue as they are, without remedy, we will lose even the little that is available. There is a dire need for preservation, archiving these local histories for the next generation. What is the role of oral history in African tradition and Adventism? Now, I come from a background where I did have a little experience living in rural South Africa, and I was exposed to the oral kind of tradition where men gather together, women gather together around the well, and men would gather around in various events around the kraal, as we call it. And so these were places where a lot of discussion was going on regarding the community issues, and there would also be a place under the chief where all the men gather together to discuss various problems and issues that matter for the community. And so in these oral contexts, the head of the household, you find that it may be a man or a woman, is responsible for passing down the family traditions and history. And in every community there is a local historian. It may be a man or a woman who is the custodian of the history of that community. It was interesting when we were in Ghana, somebody alerted me as we were sitting listening to a man giving an account of the history of that place. And there was a lady sitting right behind, and whenever he missed something, she would stand up and point out that he needs not to forget this particular issue. And she did it more than once, and we realized there is a person here that is actually supposed to be giving the history, but she doesn't have the platform. Therefore, she, is the one that is, correcting the man. So this may be done this passing on of the heritage or the stories, may be done in the form of stories or other mediums, depending on the occasion. This oral tradition is also a means to pass on values to the younger generation. In recent times, this is happening less and less. The status of oral history in African Adventism, Joy Parr asks a pertinent question. How should oral historians retune our practice when we are conducting research amidst the legacies of conflict? She suggests that there are relationships that bind the historian in both the creation and the analysis of the narratives. If we're privy only to the digitized transcripts produced from interviews, not the process nor the context which informed their making, how will we make good use of the information accumulating in digital archives? So as we look at oral history, there is a controversial issue, and that relates to research method. Although methods of oral history have been applied throughout the ages, one could cite a number of places where oral history in Europe, USA, has been used and still being used. Prior to that, there were huge gaps in African history books, and due to the problems presented by human memory and its unreliability in certain contexts, the method was initially treated with a great deal of skepticism. Only gradually has it won wide acceptance and been utilized more widely. And so the idea is to try and find ways to authenticate this important part of history or aspect of history or method of history. A true challenge for historians is the fact that collective memory is sometimes less reliable than individual memory, because people repeat what they hear and what is commonly accepted as truth. But what is truth is the oral testimony of a chief truer than that of a common villager? What is a historian to do if chiefs of different tribes contradict each other in their versions of the past? So one has to find a way to deal with these issues. Let me jump, with my time running out, to the last part.
You have 10 minutes.
Okay. Legitimizing oral history. According to Joy Parr, we have taken refuge in methodology, hoping that a thick barrier of safeguards will protect us from what Johannes Fabian identifies as charges of intellectual distortion, historical contingency, and law of special interests. Oral history has presented a number of problems that need a level of control when one uses it to present historical evidence. Most historians in the Western world will dig into archives and individual records to produce written evidence that supports oral histories. How does one present oral history as evidence when there is no documentary support available? This question confronted not only historians but also the legal fraternity in many Western countries. We will take a case study of a Supreme Court of Canada that handled a case, Van der Piet case in 1996, as an illustration of how Adventist oral history in Aboriginal context may be accepted as sufficient evidence without any supporting written records. Chief Justice Loma of the Supreme Court of Canada gave the following proposition. In determining whether an Aboriginal claimant has produced evidence sufficient to demonstrate that her activity is an aspect of a practice, custom, or tradition integral to a distinctive Aboriginal culture. A court should approach the rules of evidence and interpret the evidence that exists with a consciousness of the special nature of Aboriginal claims, and in the evidentiary difficulties in providing a right which originates in times where there were no written records of the practices, customs, traditions engaged in. The court must not undervalue the evidence presented by Aboriginal claimants simply because that evidence does not conform precisely with evidentiary standards that would be applied. So this is a very interesting development where various groups of oral communities pitched up in the Canadian Supreme Court with claims that were of such a nature that the only evidence they had was more oral history than any records. I will skip some of the discussions around this and focus more on some important principles that have been suggested that could help in enhancing this idea of authenticating oral history. To sum up this particular case and how the courts and legal practitioners dealing with oral history in communities develop principles on how to actually authenticate oral history. At the outset of the trial, it would be helpful in these cases for the counsel to outline the traditions of the people they represent relating to the questions of, number one, how their oral history or stories, legends, customs, and traditions are preserved. Who is entitled to relate such things, and whether there is a hierarchy in that regard. Community practice, what are the safeguards of its oral history, who will be called at the trial to relate such evidence. And then there are also issues of age, traditional knowledge of the people that are actually presenting evidence. All those are important issues that were considered. How widespread is a given tradition within claimant community? How consistent with the accounts of a given tradition? Can we find published accounts? So these are all questions that they have to deal with. Let me, in the few minutes left, just share with you some pictures of some of the communities I visited in Ghana. Here we were in Temelokwe in Cote d'Ivoire. This is the mayor of the little town that received us in a way that amazed us as we were coming into his territory. So, I thought we would just go to the Adventist church, but the local people said, no, we have to first go to the mayor, which is the chief, and we report there. And the kind of reception we received was, such amazing. And this is outside, and this is the local church community where we had a number of people sharing their oral stories about how the church started there. And what was interesting was that it was only the elders that were sharing the story, yet we had people that I was interested to hear their voices. I was interested to hear the people that were descendants of the pioneers. They were there, and I wanted to hear their stories, how they interacted with the pioneers. but according to the protocol there, it was the elders that were supposed to give the story, and everybody else had to be silent. And this was a school in ruins, and these are the descendants of all the local missionaries in that particular area that I never got to hear their stories. And I'm sure if we had the opportunity, there is a lot that would have come out of those descendants as they reflect on how they have experienced in their family the Adventism in its early stages, and memories of stories they had heard of these pioneers. This was my interest. Okay, our time is up. At this particular site, they came. Also, there was just one person to do the presentation, one of the elders, and people came with their pictures, their photographs, artifacts, and there were stories. There was a bell, and there was a story around that bell, a Bible that belonged to a pioneer. It was all so interesting, the opening up of the community so that their story can be heard. In conclusion, the skepticism around oral tradition and history due to an unwarranted devaluation of the method has led to a discrediting of numerous documents that largely base their historiography on oral history. A number of potential sources of oral history have died without making their voices heard. The poor capturing of some of the oral history has led to a widening of the gap between written and oral history. Another factor that fueled the negative view of oral history was the illiteracy of some of these proponents. The unmasking of these biases will fuel agitation and further obscure the context of the past that would be presented by perspectives from oral societies. Embracing oral history and tradition will open a flood of perspectives, and I hope that these could be developed further so that we may have not only archives of oral history, but actually interpretation of these stories in the context of Adventism. Thank you very much.
So far, so good. Thank you to both Dr. Devir and Dr. Sokupa for keeping so tightly to the time that we've scheduled. I appreciate that I didn't have to, like sometimes my elders, were praying for 5 minutes, in the church. You have to kind of pull them at the back and say, okay, it's time. You were perfect. Very Germanic. We have the third paper that will be delivered by Lisa Clark Diller, who is a historian and teaches on the early modern history at Southern Adventist University in Chattanooga. Recently she returned, spending a year as visiting professor at Avondale College of Higher Education in Australia. Her PhD is from the University of Chicago for a dissertation focused on the English Catholic contribution to the Act of Toleration of 1689. She researches and writes on religious minorities and the development of modern liberal democracy, especially the limits of citizenship and toleration in the early modern world. She's currently focusing on Gilbert Burnett's vision of church and state in his History of the Reformation. She has published book chapters on Huguenot immigrants in England and analysis of Protestant theories of church-state relations, and also essays on Christians and social justice. I'm delighted that we are so diverse on this panel, Jewish and African and female and Croatian. It's just amazing. So welcome with me, Lisa Diller.
First, I'm going to do some advertising. For the Conference on Faith and History, if you are a historian at this conference, you should think about joining the Conference on Faith and History potentially. It is a conference for Christians and who are also historians. It's not necessarily people who do Christian history. We have conferences every 2 years. There's one at our 50-year anniversary is at Calvin College this fall. I also have the call for papers, and I would wish to have more of this group at that event. So, family history is challenging for the professional historian. Few practicing historians write about researching their own families, and there can be a sense that such investigations are the arena of the history buff, which I learned in grad school was a major put down. It's a criticism, it's a bad word to be a history buff, apparently, or a, God forbid, genealogist. I am writing Lily and Orly Ford's articles for the Encyclopedia Seventh-day Adventist History, and Lillian and Orly were missionaries to South America in the first part of the 20th century, and Lily was my father's great aunt. She was Sam Schaefer's sister. Sam and Susie Schaefer had 11 children, one of whom was my grandmother, Evelyn Clark, and many of Sam and Susie Schaefer's children became Seventh-day Adventists, are active in the church, so I have cousins and second cousins and third cousins once removed that I work with and interact with, and we can't worry too much about nepotism because there's just too many of them. Over the decades at family reunions, he and his cousins and my grandmother passed along to me the legends they had heard about Orly and Lily when they were growing up and the memories they had of the few times they met them. And Lily and Orly Ford's model of ministry and service became one of the major forces in developing the Schaefer family's self-image and identity. My family are all very excited about the fact that I'm writing about them, but I know that sometimes the stories we learn through legend and lore can end up being unverifiable, and so may not make it into the official histories. So perhaps the most important element of these family heroes for us won't end up being what historians consider to be their significance, or perhaps mitigating factors in their life might end up looking like criticisms of them to the family members. So I've begun this work with some trepidation for many reasons, all of which have to do with situating the context and the history of Orly and Lily Ford. So historians are interested in significance in the so what, right? And connections between the particular and the general. So as I tell this story, I'm stretched by trying to situate the Ford story, especially Lily's story, which for the purposes of this paper is what I'm concentrating on, is Lily Ford herself, within historiographical and methodological streams that I know very little about. I have reworked this paper, actually, this weekend to situate it within the context of scholarship I've heard in the last 5 days, actually, between the Conference on Faith and History, the American Society of Church History, and the panels and plenary addresses yesterday. So this paper is an attempt to get at how I am going to be situating Lily Ford's story in methodological context, in the paradigm of missionary history, women's history, Latin American history, and of course, in my own family context. So none of these streams or paradigms within which to assess or analyze their history are that familiar or comfortable to me. So I hope I'm going to hear from some of you maybe with more training in these fields to help me kind of find and articulate a useful so what in those arenas. So I'll tell you a brief history of Lily and Orly Ford. Lillian Ford is the full name. Both were born in the 1890s. Orly, the son and grandson of pioneers to Walla Walla, Washington. His grandfather had been friends and migrated with Marcus Whitman. And Lily was the child of Midwestern farmers with a father who never became an Adventist and a mother who struggled to strengthen her children's faith. Orly's grandfather became an Adventist in his old age, and his father became one before he had children. Orly and Lily met at Walla Walla. Both were interested in missions into South America. Most likely, it appears from the stories that Fernando and Ana Stahl had given and printed. They were married in 1917, so 100 years ago last year. I didn't really realize that until the end of this week, actually. Went for training at Loma Linda for 2 months, and then went to Peru for 3 years, to Ecuador for 9 years, and with 2 furloughs within that time period. They were then transferred to Central America. They lived in Guatemala for 5 years, and then lived out the rest of their lives, 3 more decades in Orly's case, and 4 more decades in Lily's case in Costa Rica. They birthed 5 children, buried 3 of them, and adopted another. Their work consisted mostly of medical work in Peru and Ecuador, but when they went to Costa Rica and Central America, they became more involved in administration. Orley as conference president and evangelist, and Lilly as missionary volunteer secretary. Although Orley appears to never have stopped pulling teeth, even in his retirement years. He would go places and pull a bunch of teeth in the village along with, or the town, cities, even along with preaching. It seems that Orley died of cancer in the early 1970s, and Lilly continued to live in their home and to work in the center of San Salvador, across the street from the conference headquarters, until she moved in with her son at the age of 92 in 1986. It took her that long to decide she needed to move in with her son. Such are the facts as I've been able to kind of ascertain them so far. But to situate them requires some steps where I fear to tread. I heard a great discussion on David Holland's panel on the Conference on Faith and History about the difference between biography and microhistory sometimes, and how microhistories allow us to take somebody's life and learn something about the context from studying it. Biographies are usually attempt to kind of have someone out of time and space and say we can continue to be inspired by them today. I don't know that genre that well, so I'm thinking that we're doing a little bit of both here. So in the methodological context, of course, I'm a historian of the early modern Atlantic and Mediterranean worlds. I've been really thrilled in studying this, how many print primary sources I can have, typed primary sources, typed letters. It's just giddy. I'm not used to the immediacy, though, with what I'm studying, and kind of a finite organization to these people. Like all historians, when I volunteered to do this assignment, I went right away for the secondary sources, what had been written on the Fords, and all my relatives pointed out this book, These Fords Still Run, which was published in the I think my parents and my relatives get confused between things they learned from the Fords and things they read in here, honestly. But I found another, looks like for young adults, that was written in 1990, and a book by Eileen Lantry, and this, The Fords Still Run, but there's also some reference to the Fords in Floyd Greenleaf's masterful history of Adventist work in South America. His was the only academic work I could really find information on, and in no way constituted a biography. In the primary sources, there's quite a bit here in the archives, letters between Orley Ford and the GC, most of which have to do with his time in the Andes. I've not been able to track down Lilly's personal letters yet. I still have a lot more places to go for finding those. But I was able, right in the Key Library in Chattanooga, able to find a book she wrote in 1931 under the name Mrs. Orley Ford, called In the High Andes, which apparently no one in my family knew existed, and which is both kind of more personal and also, but is also clearly, it's published by Southern Publishing, and it seems very clear to me that it's a promotional piece. I'll get back to that maybe a little bit later. In terms of oral and family history, I am calling up elderly relatives, asking for their memories, trying to track down other people that are descendants of Orley and Lilly themselves, as opposed to her brother's descendants. But more interestingly and potentially troubling to me is how much I find myself already influenced by the oral histories I've heard and the complexities of family relationships with their many layers of perhaps misunderstanding or understanding. For instance, some of the family met the youngest adopted son of Lilly Ford. His name was Billy, and I heard disparaging remarks made about him, along with the notion that since he was adopted, he might not be a legitimate source of information or a good representative of the Ford legacy. He was adopted at the age of 3. And this book, for instance, is dedicated to their 2 birth children, doesn't make any mention of him. So these issues on my own, having rich resources or strong engagement with the subject complicates research in so many ways that I'm not used to. These issues and my own emotional connection and inspiration to study this woman underlay my professional commitment to being honest about the evidence and telling the whole truth. And so for the first time in my professional life, I'm having to think about the disadvantage of having personal affection, even at a distance, for the subject of your research. The lessons here are useful not just for families, but for any history that involves our identity and a close community. Being a public historian can involve treading on popular values and views, but equally applying a professional perspective to a family or church's stories adds richness and depth sometimes, even given a bit of gentle understanding and affection. The entire project of the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists involves these delicacies in many ways and requires me to ask basic historical questions about what sources I'm listening to and whether one can ever be balanced and objective in crafting narrative about the past. This is not news, obviously, but writing the biography of Lily and Orly Ford has allowed me to hone some of those competencies. So another area of contextualization that is needed is Latin American history. So I'm going to go through like 3 big areas here methodologically, and then Latin American history. I do know something about Latin American history by virtue of being a teacher of the early modern Atlantic world and having read my way to some understanding about modern Latin America as well. And I find myself reflexively situating Lily's writing a biography within the context of what I know of broader Latin American politics, art, history. And this is different than it would be for most of my family if they were doing the reading for inspirational or family history. So for instance, Lily's book consistently refers to the political and cultural groups in Peru and Ecuador using the terms liberal and conservative, with great preference for liberal. My mom read this book because I had it in my home over the holidays, over Christmas, and she said, "Oh, don't you think it's interesting how positive she is about liberal? She sees liberal as something positive, where today many traditional, even American Seventh-day Adventists might see liberal as a negative thing, but she thought it was positive." Well, that's not really the same thing that liberal and conservative meant in Latin America in the first part of the 20th century. So, I have to explain that sort of thing, that liberal progressive is associated with Protestants, modernity, U.S., capitalism, versus conservative and religious, which saw the Catholic Church and the old landowners wanting to promote traditional economies and paternalism. So virtually all Americans would have found the Liberal Party to be the one they identified with. And as those were the people that were recruiting and allowing Protestant missionaries and merchants into their countries. However, Lily was actually much more nuanced in her understanding of Latin American politics and context. She and Orly and the Adventist missionaries in general saw themselves as allies of the Indians. And this not only set them against the conservative party, because they were advocating for the Indians against the landowners and the Catholic Church, but it also allied them against the racism and control of the progressives as well, the Liberal Party. Lily, in many ways, embodied the apolitical orientation that Alec Rowry discussed yesterday. Even though, as a modern and civilized, she had no problem using those words, kind of heathen and savage versus civilized, North American, she could not escape her commitment to modernization. But her book lays out the ways she and Orly helped the Indians, for instance, with their collective land ownership, rather than relying on private property in the way that the liberals would have wanted at that time. The role of race in political orientation is one that Lily does not explicitly lay out, but has several hints at how she's thinking about it and what's going on in her writing. So in one tragic case, the local Indians revolted against the state, identifying all white people as their enemies and attacking and killing many of them, or attempting to kill many of them, only succeeding in one. Lily's description of that harrowing time, she and Orly were separated. She was in their house by herself, and he was in another town, hours and hours walk away. Lily's description of that harrowing time shows the difficulty she found in negotiating her loyalties. Her own personal danger meant that she very much allied with the white people, as she said. The Indians were out for white blood, she wrote, and the missionaries came very close to being attacked many times. The governor finally sent soldiers out to protect them, sending cables to them like, you need to leave because there's going to be uprisings. She wrote that Indians were on the warpath and were like wild dogs thirsting for blood. Even though she sympathized with the Indians as being exploitive and usually being just submissive to authority, her own personal danger in this situation made it hard for her to understand or sympathize with their predicament. So other elements from Latin American history that Lily's story is situated in and helps make meaning of, and which her writing could potentially help us understand a bit more, are the role of the Catholic Church in Indian life, economic development and exploitation, as well as infrastructure expansion, what's going on with roads and automobiles in that time, the extraction economy, international relations. And with respect to the identity and place of the indigenous people in the society, Lily and Orly's writing and history demonstrates a tantalizing connection between how Americans at the turn of the last century viewed the Indians they were familiar with in North America compared to the local people they met and served, whether as missionaries or in other capacities. Orly's family connection with the Nez Perce and Walla Walla, his father and he were both said to have fluency in Nez Perce language. And that role of his view of the Indians in Walla Walla is deeply tied into and included in some of his oral histories of his childhood and and moving into South America. The specific language, of course, that Lily uses and the role of non-indigenous people in mediating between Indians and the state, these are all situated within the larger context of how nationalism and capitalism were impacting Indian communities throughout the Americas. I also need to situate this story in missionary history. So I've had the privilege at this conference and more recently at the ASCH to hear papers that discuss the context of missionary history. This is a growing field both within and without the Christian history scholarship. And Lily's story most obviously must be situated within her participation in the heyday of American missions. She describes her participation, she herself describes thickly her participation in the student volunteer movement that Edwin Allen talked about yesterday. In fact, she specifically outlines the different bands associated with parts of the world that the SVM used. She and Orly met because they were part of the South American band. Within the Adventist South and Central American missionary context, the Fords are seen as direct inheritors of Fernando and Elna Stahl, who were the legendary advocates and effective evangelists who have identified so closely with the Indians. My parents spent their first year of marriage in Peru and just kind of saw themselves as completely steeped in the Stahls. Everyone still remembered them. Other themes that show up in the Lily Ford story and need contextualizing within missionary historiography are the impact of missions on literacy versus healthcare. Christy Chu-Shan Chow and Michael Campbell have researched the ways, and Ruth and I participated in a panel with them at the SCH last week, have researched the ways Adventist emphasis on literacy was variously effective, depending on the context in Asia. And I see some of those same issues rising up here, whether their Adventist mission emphasis on literacy sometimes undermined them in places where oral history was more important. So it's just the medical work is really the only thing that's sort of useful. The challenge, as Ruth Crocombe has recently articulated of whether or not and to what extent to ally with the political elites. Should they be doing that or not? As Ruth has shown in the China context, Lily Ford's promotional materials highlight their close relationship with the elites as something to celebrate. But Lily is more cautious and ambivalent about the impact of those elites on the Indians, who she very much prioritizes in her evangelism efforts. Also, the use of local workers and the relative value put on them. Lily consistently discussed the local workers in her writing and their need for them, and much of the time she doesn't name them, but many cases she does give them their names. Lily's story could also be talked about with respect to women's involvement in missions. I need to find out whether or not she was paid and for how much of her time, but she was certainly running the school, serving as a midwife, and widely considered to be valued by a team. In fact, in a petition by the Indians of Ecuador to the government, the local ones where they were at, asking that the Fords be allowed to stay in the country, Lily's work is mentioned at 2 different points in the petition. Orly's is only mentioned once. But it is clear that Orly is given precedence in the missionary literature. It was his name, not Lily's, that Ed mentioned yesterday in the list of missionaries who had participated in the SVM, even though she's the only one that leaves a longer history of their work in that. Promotional material. Lily wrote many of the stories and material that were needed, especially in Central America, to raise money and support for the work. I think this book is published by Southern Pub is fascinating in that it never ever alludes to Adventists. Never refers to any Adventist distinctives like Sabbath keeping, diet, alcohol, anything like that. They're just referred to as Christians. It doesn't use the name Adventist at all. And I don't know if that's because it was intended to be sold to Christians in the United States as a way to raise money. It doesn't seem to be for an Adventist audience. It is potentially part of a genre of missionary story, which is how many Americans got their information about the world. And Lily took great pains to give cultural, political, historical, and geographic descriptions for her readers. She clearly saw this as an educational as well as an inspirational book. And of course, I mentioned David Holland's panel at the Conference on Faith and History, which inspired me to think about the ways this work is situated within the writing of women's history. This is an area about which I know very little, but based on some of the ideas from that panel and from my reading of approaches to women's history, I think Lily's life and work can illuminate our general understanding of how women have made their way in the world. And also themes from that field can help us understand Lily better herself. So the issue of resources to study women's lives. Lily's letters weren't saved as much as Orly's were. She isn't seen as the official missionary, and so the General Conference has less on her. There's also the issue of self-presentation. David Holland has looked at the way autobiography and is affected by gender roles. And certainly Lily wasn't trying to assert herself in some feminist mode. I mean, she's Mrs. Orley Ford in writing this book. She includes very little about her personal life, her motherhood, or the domestic side of things, which Holland has characterized as perhaps an attempt to see women seeing their stories as universal. The more you focus on the domestic, the more it's sort of seen as, oh, that's women's stuff, rather than kind of a universal story. However, she did highlight the work, role, and significance of women in her writing, a whole chapter on Mrs. Inca. It's like her only anthropological kind of part of her book about Indian life. She calls Mrs. Inca, personifies the children and domestic work imaginatively. But of course, with women's history, there's also the issue of agency, and even the role of personality in promoting some women more than others. Lily seems to definitely have benefited from joint stories. All the stories are about both of them together. This picture of both of them on the front is typical. So perhaps because she wrote a book about it, and she's the author of the promotional materials, she's also known to be extroverted. Thank you. She is extroverted, and people who knew her, she was very hospitable. She's the one that brought lots of people to her home. So there is the role of kind of personality traits and charisma in what women get talked about. So she, I think, generated many of the oral histories that Westfall's book is based on. And so what's fascinating, though, is what the later writers do to and about her, and I think women's history can help us understand this a little bit, too. Westfall totally romanticizes the work in many ways that Lily does not. Her earlier writing is not at all romantic about what was going on. Although Westfall's oral histories that she used to write her book may reflect Lily's age and memory later in her life. The Lantry work, by the way, is almost unforgivable in its portrayal of Lily as a reluctant, shrieking, hesitant maternal figure, reliant on Orly, fearful, who only did mission work like running the Missionary Volunteer Society because her own children had died, and so she wanted to invest in them. The evolution of Lily through the books published in the 20th century on them, might help us think about the cultural shifts and how women are viewed, different audiences, the Christian versus secular context, as well as helping me understand why and how this happened to Lily. And as with Bill Knott, who talked to us yesterday, and others here, I'm situating this history and using it to make meaning of my own life and my family's values. The role of education, missions, being healthy and long-lived, adoption, are all themes that show up in my own family of origin sense of itself. The Fords often are cited as progenitors and promoters of those values. I can see that this isn't exactly straightforward, and with my historian's eyes, and with their history, complicates what is often seen as a direct lineage of these values and reasons for my family's prioritization of them. So I have to say that placing my subject in these contexts enriches my understanding of them. It's more interesting to think about the stories this way, and placing people I've studied in the context of women's history, missions, Latin American history, makes me appreciate other studies in those topics more because I have ties to them. So making connections, studying context, assessing complexity, pointing out contingency, analyzing change over time, all the 5 C's of history, that's what we historians do. In the end, of course, the Fords are no less inspiring for having their work and lives situated in context and subjected to analysis. My family can enjoy and be inspired by their history, even if they are unable to confirm some of their legends.
I praised all 3 too early because Lisa finished a minute before. I didn't even give her the sign for a minute. It's amazing. You've timed it. You must have. Wonderful,
I
thank
teach
you.
undergraduates, they walk out.
All right, well, we have some time for Q&A, and yes, we'll start.
Michael, and maybe Lisa to a certain extent, in these oral stories, sometimes our memories are not so good, with dates especially. They tell a good story, but I know in Africa a lot of the people didn't remember exactly when they were born. They just, this year or that. How do you confirm? Did you have any problem with that? Did you all have any problem with confirming and ratifying what the exact timing of the oral stories?
My dad is 95. He doesn't know exactly when he was born. Actually, this is just an estimation.
Yeah.
So it is a general problem for especially earlier histories. where there are no records. But what happens is there is a lot of comparison that one can do, because about 10 years ago, somebody in the family remembered that my dad was born in the same year with somebody else, and that person had everything in record. And so that way, we were able to get the exact, approximate year at least. So there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in comparing stories from different sources in order to establish what is accurate, and also in some cases it may just be approximation if there's just no record at all. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, please. Gary.
Yeah, my question is for Lisa. You showed that book and you talked about how it was unforgivable the way that it treated the character, but there's a whole genre of these missionary books purporting to be factual descriptions of what happened, which have inspired generations of Adventists to mission service. How do we describe this genre? Is it a fictional genre? Is it a part factual genre? Is it a mythical genre? What is its value, and how do we approach it? Do we approach these books as texts that give us real insight, or how should we best approach them?
Yeah, I thought about that later. I was like, oh, I shouldn't have said that word. That was a bit strong. I didn't write that. I just.
That's true.
So I talked about that under the context of women's history and sort of how women are portrayed. I think the Westfall book is probably a more traditional mission story book, and I know it did inspire a lot of people. And it is much more even-handed in seeing both Lily and Orly as equally called to the mission field, as equally, and it is based on the Westfall's conversations with them and staying with their family, and you can tell that that's from it. It's not an academic book. It does novelize, for lack of a better way of saying it. I'm not a literature person, but a lot of what happened, and so I wouldn't see it as. But I mean, this is storytelling. There's a place for storytelling in our societies, and I don't begrudge. I begrudge the quite sexist way that Lily is portrayed in this book, because I mean, it seems to be have relied almost entirely on the Westfall book, but just kind of made it for a young adult audience. And I just very frustrated with her seeming like someone who's constantly not wanting to go, and Orly having to talk her into it and build her up because she's too scared, and things like that. That was just upsetting to me in that sense. But I'm all right with mission stories as a form of storytelling. I think we do storytelling in a lot of different ways and for a lot of different purposes in society. And how do I feel about any history thing I care about being made into a movie and everyone going to go see it and then asking me about it? I'm glad people might be interested in history. What do you say? I'm glad that inspires you to think more about this and dig a little deeper. Good. I take what I can get, I guess.
Yes.
Just a comment on that, and then I have a question for Nathan. I've done some looking at these stories as well, and they're very fascinating. I think we need a good detailed study on the mission story genre. But one thing in relation to women specifically, excuse me, that I have seen is when you get to the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, I have seen a number of these missionary biographies on women, and some of them have even explicitly stating, here is a woman who is serving the Lord and doesn't need to be ordained. And I've seen that on the back cover of a couple of these books. And so some of these books have that kind of a flavor for women, and there is in these stories sort of a theological or political agenda depending upon the author. And so these things need to be explored, I believe,
That's fascinating.
in more detail. Nathan, I had a question for you. Because I'm fascinated and I'm curious about your research, and is there a lot of daily interaction between the Judaizers and Seventh-day Adventists, or do they ever actually worship together in the same place? Or are there any regular things that they do? I mean, this is aside, of course, from the fact that some of them intermarry. And so that's kind of my question for you.
Great question, yeah. With regard to worship, to my knowledge, they do not worship together unless you're talking about the children of Judaizers who are in Adventist schools, and then they are expected to attend worship sessions while school is going. But I mean, if they're in the same, if they're in proximity to each other, there is quite a bit of interaction. But it doesn't go so far as, actually worshiping together with the same liturgy or manner of praise. Yeah, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. I was really struck with the images, right? Because you had a few of them where it's just like, here's Adventist sitting with, with the Judaizers, and of course I had no clue who is who, and so forth. So it sounds like they have a lot of pretty regular interaction.
In many cases they do, but as far as differentiating, who is who, right? If both groups are convinced that they're of the same Israelite lineage, right, then that means that you can define yourself ethnically or racially or culturally as being brother or sister to somebody in a neighboring community, but just kind of understand that your worship practice is a bit different, right? So it doesn't always necessarily spill over into questioning whether or not this practice is the right one. A lot of times it's just a feeling of racial or cultural commonality.
Yeah,
It happens to be Jewish.
yeah. Thank you very much.
I'll take Chair's privilege to actually ask a question and then come back to your hands. And it's provoked a little bit by Nathan's by comment and by some of the conversation just prior to Nathan's comment. And maybe Lisa and hopefully Michael, you can address this issue. Is there any pure history? Or isn't it in postmodern times that we have to learn through Levi-Strauss and Foucault and Levinas and many others that, all history is, the power history, or the powerful telling their story, and, the winners take it all. And so my question goes back to Africa, when you talked about, women group sitting there and chatting their oral history, and women and men over there with their chief, and the chief kind of later on, or the oral male historian speaks, and occasionally there is a woman that feels comfortable enough to kind of say, oh yeah, you forgot this or that. How does that play, the power play, and who actually tells the story, and when the two chiefs have totally different stories in oral history, and also for the rest of you historians, and maybe, the issue of power in terms of how stories are spinned or told, not only in novelistic style, but even sometimes in the intentional or semi-intentional historical projects.
I think in a number of communities you'll find a dynamic where there is a structure. It may be a hierarchical structure where a certain person is a spokesperson to sort of tell the story if there's a visitor coming. And also whenever a community meets, who gets to talk on behalf of the community. So these are dynamics that are there. But I think historians and researchers need to be aware of those dynamics to the extent that they are able to probe perhaps in some way people that may actually tell another perspective through interviews, and so on, so that they can get a wider perspective and actually identify some of those conflicts that are there in terms of what is presented officially and what is actually a perspective of the common people. So I think there are a lot of dynamics that have to do with community structure that need to be respected, but at the same time, I believe that researchers and historians should be aware and probe enough to get all the perspectives possible.
Thank you, Lisa. Maybe you want to comment on the kind of, from a perspective.
Sure. I don't think history is always about power, and I think the disinherited, disenfranchised have really strong stories that they have been telling, and that they have a strong sense of themselves. I mean, you think even as Seventh-day Adventists, we love we're the underdogs, we're the persecuted, we're the story, people in the Anabaptist tradition that tell the story of being kind of the persecuted and the unpowerful. So I think they're there. I think people in power haven't always heard those stories sometimes, so they might be interested in hearing a different story. But I do think that women are telling their stories and have been and telling their histories, and so have colonized people kept their stories and their histories. It's just we don't always listen. And so I do think that's why this project of history is ongoing, is because we keep trying to hear more and more and more interesting stories and thicken our understanding of it. But I don't necessarily think it is only about power. It is about listening to other people. And this is where knowing how to enter into a database and find books. My family never did know, because after this book goes out of print, it's not in the ABC anymore, if it ever was, so they didn't know it existed. Historians are partly good at tracking stuff down. So we always have a role, even for popular history, because we know how to find things. Yeah.
Thank you. Gentlemen at the back, but look, I've seen so far only people from the right. Are there any people on the... Oh, yeah. Okay. We're coming next to this side, but let me... You had the hand up.
Yes, a comment first of all for Lisa. I've learned to call that literature inspirational fiction. When you're recreating dialogue and conversation, you're recreating action scenes, you are using the methods, I have an English minor, of recreating imaginative literature. You're doing creative writing.
Sure.
And it's for a good purpose. And I am a French historian today because I read Walter Utt's The Wrath of the King. Now he's recreating something based on fact, but he's recreating it in story form. And it caught my interest deeply. And I went into French history. The other question for you, Nathan, as a practicing Jew, you mentioned the legend of the 10 Lost Tribes. You're working in Mormon territory. How do you react to their Book of Mormon view of the 10 Lost Tribes coming over here to America?
Well, my reaction is very simple. I don't touch it at all. No, my reasoning is that I couldn't get university funding to keep going to Africa if I were ever to work on Mormonism, right? No, I mean, in my research, I occasionally touch on that if we talk about, in general, missionary or colonial ideas about the ends of the earth being populated with lost tribes, right? So we talk about, Christopher Columbus or Native Americans, that kind of thing, intersects nicely with Mormon history. But that's about as far as I go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, for Nathan, you made a comment at the start in which you said that if the events of the 20th century were about Holocaust and the founding of Israel, that the activity of incipient groups in Africa would be the jury event of the 21st century. Because you make it so close to Adventists, that means you design that we're going to be heavily impacted by this. What's the situation in Africa that gives you that perspective that there's going to be that massive growth, implying that there's also going to be increase of relationships between Adventists and Jewish faith people?
Let me tackle the first part of that first. If, like we said, there are something like 14 million Jews in the world today, right, and that's based largely on self-definition, and underscored by this rabbinic idea that Jewishness is defined through the mother, not through the father, right? I mean, we can definitely pinpoint at least that many people today in the global south, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, who have some either vague or very clear notion about Jewish descent or spiritual volition, right? So just in the terms of numbers, but also with regard to the state of Israel. I mean, there are different bodies now in Israel that are acting either within the rabbinic infrastructure or kind of actively outside of it, trying to bring people from around the world to be repatriated to Israel and to be naturalized immediately, partly for a war of demography against the Arabs, but also partly for messianic expectations, right? So I think there's no way for me personally, there's no way around the recognition that this is the seminal event of this period in Jewish history, and the state of Israel, whether it tried to or not, kind of allowed this to happen, right? And that Israel becomes the ingathering point and provides infrastructure for all kinds of groups that want to make sure the exiles are brought back. With regard to how this might impact Adventist populations, I can't say. And also, I should just point out too, I have no vested interest in converting anybody to Judaism or increasing syncretism of any kind. But I mean, we do see a lot of people, leaving at least mission-based churches for these new Jewish movements, right? Because in Africa you have Christianity associated with the colonial project, Islam with the slave trade, and Judaism is something that's got a clean slate, and to boot, it's also the chosen people, and it's also in terms of psychological identification, I think easy for people to understand because of the parallels between the Holocaust and the legacy of slavery, and so forth and so on, right? So I can't say exactly how it will impact Adventists in particular, but I think it will definitely impact formerly Christianized peoples in sub-Saharan Africa who might be disenchanted with some aspect of the Christian experience.
Thank you for all of your papers. I have a question for Nathan. So in my research, I'm interested most recently in the popularization and secularization of Sabbath-keeping practices in America just in the past few decades. So, for example, with Judith Sholovitz's work on sort of her experience as a secular Jew with the Sabbath, or the popular reading of Heschel, no matter sort of what your religious affiliation may be. So we kind of see this practice of Sabbath-keeping being borrowed or implemented in communities that are outside of those that are traditionally Sabbatarian. This is sort of a random question, but do you see any connection between that and the way in which Judaism groups or new Jewish movements are growing in Africa outside of what you may consider a traditionally Sabbatarian community or region, outside of Israel? I mean, completely different continent than what we usually associate with Judaism.
That's an excellent question that I actually hadn't thought about in that way. I think I'd need to think about it some more before I gave you any kind of a serious answer, but I noticed in your blurb that you were working on Jewish Sabbatarian perspectives as well. We think about this more. Let's talk afterwards.
Two more. I'll have you and then David.
Yeah, similar question. I think it's been my experience in interfaith dialogue that Jews and Adventists will have rather distinct Sabbath-keeping practices and will often distinguish each other along those lines. Of course, Jews tend to be more restrictive, the kinds of activities that are allowed, Adventists being less so. And I'm wondering, does that play out in these communities that you observed? And if so, how? Or if not, why not?
Excellent question, yeah. Like I mentioned, a lot of these communities, being Jewish from their perspective simply means being some kind of second temple-like Jews, right? And so if you take, rabbinic prohibitions, or if you think about, for instance, driving a car on the Sabbath, right? A fellow I was with just broke into this fit of hilarious laughter when I was explaining that the rabbis consider, the mechanism of a combustion engine to be akin to lighting a fire, right? And he thought that was just simply ridiculous, and why would you believe the rabbis but not just go straight to the Bible, right? Of course. So I guess you could say on one hand there's maybe a lack of crystal clear understanding about what rabbinic ideas about Sabbath keeping are, and also there might be a hesitancy to entertain those once they realize how restrictive they might be, right? And yet, I don't want to denigrate anybody, because if you're willing to give up, one day of wages to observe the Sabbath in some way, I mean, your volition must be pretty strong.
One more, last minute, and then we'll have a very short break and get into the next session.
And Zach, I'll give up my question in order to move forward. It was just say 3 excellent papers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you to Nathan, Michael, and Lisa. Thank you.